I would like to thank our sponsor, Valent, for sponsoring these meetings. Much appreciated to them for sponsoring our thinning meetings. And then we're going to take a look at our agenda. So I'm going to give a brief background on what I saw this morning when I was traveling around the Saratoga region. Then we'll turn things over to my colleagues in Western New York, Craig and Mario, to discuss what they're seeing out in Western New York. We're also going to hear from Jim Eve and Vaughn Gingerich, some consultants in Wayne County, to share with us what they're seeing out that way. Then we will hear from Terence Robinson, who will walk us through some thinning recommendations for both of those regions. So with that, as I mentioned, I was down in Saratoga earlier this morning. So just wanted to share what I was seeing out in the field. So as pretty typical for that area, even though orchards aren't all that far apart, just topographically, we do see quite a spread in phenology between those different orchards. So orchards that are in very southern Saratoga County at this point along the Mohawk are just about petal fall in most varieties, whereas if you go about 10 miles north up in Burnt Hills, Honeycrisp are still pretty much at full bloom. So we've got quite a bit of a spread so far this year. I also did take a look to get a sense of, to what extent we may have had some damage from the cold events that we had in that last week of April. And again, variability seems to be the name of the game here. So generally speaking, I did see quite a bit of a gradient, and it did vary between orchards, sites, location within the orchard. So, hard to make general trends, but it did seem to me that there were some varietal consistencies between those different sites. So it seemed like Honeycrisp and New York 1 seemed to fare the best. I saw a couple of injured kings in a few blocks, but overall it was fairly limited. Gala, there is a little bit more damage. There I was seeing a bit more consistently some damage in the kings. Laterals were looking pretty good on most of the Gala that I looked at, though. And then the ones that really seemed to bear the most of the damage was the Mac type. So the Macs, McCowns, Cortland seemed to have quite a bit more damage. Quite a number of kings were missing on those, and in some blocks, some laterals were missing too. So I think from what I saw this morning, I would stress that it's really another one of those years where we want to take a really good close look at our different varieties, really looking at different blocks, thinking about where those low pockets were, and really getting a good assessment done before we make these thinning decisions. But from what I did see, if I had to sum things up, I do think despite some occasional king damage to slightly more king damage, for the most part, there is still a number of laterals that are looking pretty good. And I think there will be some thinning work that needs to be done this season. And I did throw up some pictures just to show some of the different damage that I was seeing. So in some cases, like you could see this photo here, we can see a cluster that really just never opened up. I think that was damaged at that timing in late April. Some did open up, but we can see that the pistils are all brown and necrotic. So I had some damage there. And then even where it looked like the clusters were looking pretty good, we are seeing some of these kings that are short and are already starting to yellow up and are clearly going to be falling off. So the actual visuals that we're seeing are also fairly spread out between the region too. So with that, I'll turn things over to my colleagues, Craig and Mario, to discuss what they're seeing out in Western New York.
Sure, I can start. Thanks, Mike. And I echo Mike, and a lot of what he said is very, very similar in Western New York. I've been looking a lot in Niagara County. I also, Liz and Janet on our team looked at samples, looked at damage this morning in Niagara and Orleans County, and Mario will tell you about Wayne County. Yeah, the name of the game is things are really all over the place. You really need to look at your blocks in detail to make decisions on thinning. We're all over the place. There's, as far as phenology, there's some blocks that are well past petal fall, and kings are as big as 7 or 8, but I think mostly they're in the 4 to 5 to 6 range. Laterals mainly probably in the 4 to 5 range, but some laterals are as little as 2.5 and as high as 4.5. There are some blocks that are still 50% of the flowers are open. There's still some blocks with 5 or 10 or 15% pink. There's quite a few blocks that have damage, missing flower clusters, missing fruit on the bottom of the trees. And then the middle and the tops look okay. And there's some blocks that have just blank trees interspersed in the orchards. There are some clusters that you go up to and they kind of fall off real easily. Damage in Kings, there's a few blocks that really have near 100% damage, but I think overall there's a lot less. I would say anywhere between no damage and 20 to 30% if I was going to take an average. But again, the bottom line is there's so much variability. Laterals, like Mike said, there's a lot of laterals out there, even though I have noticed the good thing is in some of these blocks is they are singling nicely. There's a lot of blocks in which there's only 1 or 2 laterals left, sometimes none on a cluster, and the king is healthy and growing. So that could help a little bit in your thinning job. But like Mike said, I still think you're certainly going to need to thin, and it's going to be a little tricky, but it's really good to know what you have by going and walking the orchard and seeing where your variability is. That's all I got. If Mario wants to give his insight from Wayne County. And certainly,
Yes.
go ahead.
Yeah, so I visited 39 blocks today. Okay, and I just finished and I couldn't most of what I tried to do is to see the inland. So I saw almost 29 inland sites. So the Ida Red, I thought Ida Red could be bigger because last year when I did this evaluation was May 13, so it was the same day. And Ida Red was a little bigger, at least in Wayne County. This year, the Ida Red was smaller. I think so Ida Red was 6. I saw one site in close to Newark with Ida Red 5 to 6. So that was very different for me. It's a ton of more. I would like to say if I saw only one grower today in Wayne County that was really thinking to take out the bees. So everybody, I didn't see anybody thinking to take the bees today or tomorrow. Perhaps the bees are gonna be for 1 or 2 more days. People were spraying today for 5, like nobody was doing any thinning spray. So it's a significant amount of, today was the bloom of rum, today was the bloom of a snapdragon. Snapdragon was blooming. Today was the bloom of honeycrisp. Honeycrisp was still blooming at 30% perhaps. And perhaps honeycrisp, when you are lucky enough to have honeycrisp next to Gala in Wayne County, you can really see that honeycrisp was more damaged. So you have the situation, even though you can see the petals perhaps in honeycrisp today, you're gonna see those petals brown. And if you pass your fingers in that branch in this area, you're gonna see a lot of shelling of those fruitlets. So perhaps honeycrisp situation, if you see the entire cluster, is definitely the kings missing. But in general, if you have missing 2 to 3 of the 5, or 1 to 3, or 3 to 4 of the 5. But it's not completely wiped out in honeycrisp. I think so. It definitely Gala was more protected that day. You can see the pink even in Gala today in San Rose in inland side. So still you can see traces of pink. I come back to a Cortland that was pretty bad after the damage. The grower was thinking that that was a completely loss, but Cortland was still pushing flowers today, and we were able still to find fruitlets there. Let me see, what else can I share? Jonagold was big. Ida Red, I mentioned, Ida Red was still blooming at 5 to 8%, still blooming. Gala was still blooming, like I say. Fuji, perhaps another one that I saw with 1 to 3 good fruitlet per cluster. or perhaps 2 to 3 of the 5. Fuji was already pushing the shoots, and I didn't see any apogee thing, effect of apogee. I think so apogee perhaps gonna be a spray for those shoots on Wednesday or Thursday. I saw a good set in an inland side with Linda Mac, with AC Mac. So it's all over, like Craig was saying. I think I visited only one tango, and I saw missing kings, a lot of missing kings and dropping there. So it's fruit there in general. Nothing is perfect. I didn't see one single strong cluster in Gela. Those very upright cluster that sometimes you can see at this stage, I didn't see that situation. I saw one good Gela block, perhaps a couple good Gela blocks, but still there were no the same clusters, those strong clusters where you can see even 5 or 6 hanging there very strong. So for me, it was a little, I thought we could be a little earlier by today, but and I was able to talk with Liz T my way back, and I got the idea that your kings, your in either were bigger, still there. So still I see the separation between Orleans and Wayne County. That's it. I think so.
Thank you, Mario. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Jimmy, if he'd like to give his comments about what he's been seeing in Wayne County.
Thank you, Mike. This morning, I looked at one farm inland, trying to get some kind of assessment of the king bud scenario. In a Gala block, 40 buds, 36 kings were present. In a Mac block, 28 kings were present. In a Honeycrisp block, 25 kings were present. So I was fairly comfortable with that. There's a lot of sides in the Honeycrisp, in the Max, each of those varieties. They're going to, there is I think, so, and this was inland, it's not true on every farm, has been suggested, but I think there's a pretty fair king crop potential. How we work around thinning it is going to take a little bit of study. Where the king is dominant. And one thing I noticed, I was out in the field yesterday and I made some measurements, and most of the largest fruit was 4, 5, and sometimes 6 millimeters. And the sepals had not closed. Today I noticed that the sepals were closing. And I think that's on a high a high percentage of the fruit, which is suggesting maybe a pretty heavy set, in spite of the lack of warm weather. The other thing that I noticed, I count leaves periodically in this growth study that I work on every year, and I had 9 to 10 terminal leaves, and Max and Galas that I look at every week. The year the week before that, it was around 8 or so. So there wasn't a whole lot of growth in the last week as compared to the week before. But certainly the weather may be an issue there. But I'm also wondering about the stress of setting a crop, if that's competing a little bit. Because we're mostly on reserves. I think Terence will, I'm sure, have a thought about that, but I think we're on reserves no more than we are making enough carbohydrates. But there is some foliage developing, but it's still, I think, rather limited. And a comment that Mario made about Cortlands, they're terrible. It doesn't matter much where I go to see those, but out of a curiosity, anyway, they're pretty rough. There will be some, but they took a pretty heavy hit. But snapdragons are still in bloom. Not looking too bad, I don't think. The Fuji's are still in bloom. I think they'll be all right, though there's some damage in both of those varieties. But the galas and the Honeycrisp, which is a bulk of what we're doing, it looks promising to me at this point. It'll take some work, but it looks promising.
All right, great. Thank you, Jim. That's encouraging to hear. Vaughn, I would like to invite you to tell us about what you're seeing in your area.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I just echoing a lot of what's already been said. A huge amount of variability out there. In general, galas definitely looks like they came through considerably better than a number of varieties. Fuji's, there's a lot of variability block to block. There's some Fuji blocks that are pretty bad. And then there's other Fuji blocks that are really pretty good. And I think some of that has to do with some of the spread in phenology from block to block. Empires, I saw a number of Empire blocks today that are already starting to drop a lot of fruitlets. I think in general set on Empires looks pretty weak on a lot of blocks. Cortlands, I agree, Cortlands are terrible. A lot of Red Delicious blocks are pretty bad. Honeycrisp in general, further to the south where you can tell at this point, they look pretty decent. Again, some kings missing in some things, but a decent number of laterals. Further up by the lake, it's just too early to tell at this point. There's a lot of stuff that's still only just beyond full bloom and into very early petal fall. What I would say is this is going to be a tough one to figure out what to do because there is a lot of differences out there in terms of what fruitlets within clusters are damaged, whether it's the laterals or whether it's the king bloom. There's a lot of difference top to bottom of trees. There's a lot of difference high areas to low areas. There's definitely enough potential out there for a good crop, but it's going to be a tough one to figure out how to do some thinning in some places.
Certainly, thank you, Vaughn. It seems to be the theme of the day here. It is, hopefully there's still a good amount out there. It is just going to be tricky to figure out how we go about thinning it. So I think with that, Terence, I think we've got your work cut out for you. Why don't we go ahead and turn things over to you? Let us know what we need to do here.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to be with you all, and I wish we were in person to see each other, but I hope that what I have to say might be helpful as you try to think about how to face this particular year with the frost. I always like to start with just some review of what we're trying to accomplish with the precision thinning protocol we've published. We're right now trying to decide whether or not to spray petal fall sprays. Some of you have already sprayed bloom thinning sprays. Others of you decided to forego bloom thinning sprays. And I'm guessing that the petal fall situation will be the same. Some of you will spray. I hope most of you will spray petal fall, but some of you may forego a petal fall spray. But we still have the big spray coming up in a few weeks or 10 days at the 10 to 13 millimeter. And hopefully we'll talk again because by that time the situation will be a lot clearer. I also like to start with just a review of the season. For me, green tip came early. I expect normally would be April 15th. It was in late March, 27, 28 time period. But then the temperatures between green tip and pink were relatively cool, so we did not progress to pink extremely fast like we might have. Now, temperatures since pink have been moderate. Lows or in the highs in the 60s and low 70s. And therefore, bloom has advanced relatively slowly. On a good year, that can be 5 or 6 days, but on this year was 7 days at least for the bloom period. On some really warm years, we can blow through bloom in 4 days. Our big problem were the significant frosts on April 25th and 26th. In most cases, earlier varieties were at pink, but many varieties were still at tight cluster. At that time, there didn't seem to be a lot of difference between lake sites and inland sites. Everybody was a tight cluster to pink. And it did result in significant damage to king flowers. My view is that those varieties that were already at pink suffered worse than those that were still at tight cluster. And that relates a lot to, you know, where you were. And the surprising thing to me, which I still can't figure out, we had frost damage right on the lake. We had frost damage inland. We had probably better results at Geneva than some of the traditional fruit growing areas. So it's just really weird the way the frost affected places, particularly those that were lower in elevation. Now, bloom was relatively good in most blocks. I target the full bloom in more inland sites May 3rd, more lake sites May 10th, just a couple days ago, depending on which location you were at. We tended to have relatively good bee activity during bloom. It wasn't really warm, but the bees seemed to work extremely well. Now, I've asked extension agents to help me this year with providing some data to really assess what we're seeing. And I want to emphasize that this is a year where your thinning should be data-driven. Just a windshield assessment of what's going on could get you into a lot of trouble. So this is the kind of data that I'm looking for. This was taken today. This particular slide was data was taken by Craig Kahlke, mostly Niagara County. I've separated and simplified what he sent me into inland sites and lake sites. Mostly fruit sizes inland are 4 to 6. In lake sites, very similar. You know, ginger golds, of course, are way up there. But mostly in Niagara County, we're at Petal Fall and we're 4 to 6. Now, you'll hear me later, but I'll say it now again. The best time for petal fall thinning is 5 to 6 millimeter size. So we're approaching that window in Niagara County. The problem is in the notes that Craig sent. The bottoms are light. Others had good crop and only a few damaged laterals, but others had almost no crop and bottoms nearly gone. If you look at that next to the last line, a Honeycrisp block near the lake, almost there was no Honeycrisp left in the bottom part of the tree from this frost. Therefore, the frost is very confusing to me and why it impacted some lake sites as much as it did. Now, this data is from Orleans County, from Janet Van Zoren, and I particularly like the fact that she gave us in the last 2 columns the percent kings that were damaged and the percent laterals that were damaged. So if we look at that one inland site of New York 1, almost all the kings were damaged and 50% of the laterals were damaged. That's a severe frost damage. In New York 2, which is a very early blooming variety, 90% damage and 50%. You looked at this inland site of Gala, less damage, then Honeycrisp, even less damage. But you got to Fuji, and essentially it's a wipeout of the crop. And then I moved to 2 lake sites. I'm not identifying them here on this slide just to keep confidential where this data came from. But the first 5 varieties or 6 varieties are from one site, and you can see on that lake site, 0% of Fuji were damaged. Sweet Tango, some damage, and New York 1, a little bit of damage. Honeycrisp, a little bit of damage. Almost no damage on Pink Lady. But then you go to a different lake site, starting with Evercrisp, and you start to see a lot of damage. And you get down to Gala, and 100% of the kings damage and 50% of the laterals. That is just really surprising to me. I expected Gala to be the best of all of them, and it is in some places. But in other places, it's heavily damaged. And then the Fuji is striking. In this particular lake site, there was essentially no crop, whereas an inland site of Fuji still had 95% live fruit. So we didn't get time to summarize the Wayne County data, and I appreciate Mario giving us his verbal summary a minute ago. I wanted to show data that Mike Basedow provided from Saratoga County. I simplified what he sent me, and I want to emphasize that he said in southern Saratoga, and I would say Albany County might be similar, fruits are pretty much ready to thin. In more northern Saratoga County or other higher elevation in Saratoga County, they're still only at petal fall or just going into petal fall and not ready to thin. But I want you to see that with Honeycrisp, in this particular site, there's only one site I summarized here. We did have some kings with shortened stems. Now those are going to thin off if you put thinner on. Now those with shortened stem, if you don't put any thinner on, they can stay on the tree and make a fruit with short stems, but they typically respond well to thinners and fall off. Where we looked at Max, there was quite a bit of shortened stem, strong bloom, but significant damage on McCowan. And so Mike emphasized, which I'll say again to repeat, Mac types tended to have more damage in Saratoga County than other varieties. And New York 1 in this case, pretty good, not much damage. So I want to just try to encourage each of you to collect data. The kind of data that I've just gone through with extension agents would be extremely helpful as you're trying to make decisions on what to do with each block and each variety. Now I'd like to go forward and just talk about where we're at and what it's going to be looking like for the rest of the week, because this is the week for petal fall sprays. Maybe right along the lake, some blocks might bleed into next week, but most of you will need to thin this week. This is the chart of the carbohydrate balance from the soda. Well, actually, it's the Cherry Lawn weather station, just to say where it is. And it shows that we started at a green tip in late March, and it was pretty much a deficit the whole time since then, because the tree doesn't have enough leaf area. You're working off of reserves. And I'll just comment a point that Jim Eves made, says up until about the end of full bloom, we're mostly working off of reserves. But when we get to this time of petal fall, there's a transition. And when you have 7 to 10 leaves out, you have enough that the tree relies on daily carbohydrate production, and reserves don't count that much anymore. In this particular case, you can see that full bloom was on about, I put it the 5th of May. Maybe that's not exactly right. I wasn't there. But when I look at when we're going to start thinking of petal fall sprays, it is sometime Wednesday to Saturday of this week. In that time period, we're looking at a moderate carbohydrate deficit. Now, I want you to notice the scale goes from 0 to -30. So there's no -60s or -80s. Those are really scary carbohydrate deficits. But this year, it looks like in that -20, -15, -25 time period. Now, I ran this model for every major location: Lake Inland in Wayne County, Lake Inland in Orleans, Lake and Inland in Niagara and Saratoga County. And they all have similar curves. They're slightly different, but I didn't choose to put each of those curves in the presentation. But in general, you'll see that we had essentially 0 deficit around bloom. And then since then, we've been in a moderate deficit situation. Now, so I look forward this year, the daytime temperatures in all the locations that I looked at in Western New York and Saratoga County, on one exception in Saratoga, I'll mention in a minute, temperatures are in the mid-60s to mid-70s. It's not really warm. But interestingly enough, the nighttime temperatures are going to be above average. Often they're in the 40s. This year, they're in the mid-50s. That makes a big difference on carbohydrate deficits, because at nighttime, fruitlets burn up the carbohydrate that's produced in the day. And when there's little produced in the day because of cool temperatures and cloudy conditions, they burn it up. That's why the model is showing a carbohydrate deficit for much of this petal fall thinning period. Even though it's not a huge deficit, it's a very important deficit. So the weather is going to give us moderate carbohydrate deficits, which is what we need. That gives not perfect, but good petal fall thinning. But I want to emphasize with that level of deficit, plus the fact that we're at petal fall, where the fruits are not so sensitive, means there's little risk of over thinning. The problem is if you've lost most of the fruit flowers to frost, then maybe you don't want to thin at all. But where there's a crop, and I echo what Jim Eve and Wayne said, Vaughn said, that there's a crop out there. And so there needs to be significant blocks that receive petal fall thinning. And I want to buck up your confidence by telling you there's little risk of over thinning. Now, this year, the petal fall spray, I think, is going to be an essential component to get thinning done correctly. Last year, we had problems because there was no deficit. This year, we've got a deficit to help us. Let's take advantage of it. So where there's little damage, I'm suggesting a full dose of either NA-7 or NAD-7 where there's a strong set. Alternatively, where temperatures get up to close to 70, you might consider Maxell-7 with Gala. And I did want to mention that in Saratoga County, you're predicted to get some mid-70s, whereas in Western New York, maybe a 70-ish. So Saratoga is slightly different in the kind of warm temperatures you're going to see over the next 6 to 7 days. Now, an alternative that I want to present now is the combination of Maxell and Exceed. And I'm suggesting this on a trial basis this year with Gala based upon the good results we had last year. Now, I want to show this data slide from last year. This is a trial done at Geneva. And in the upper chart, I want you to see the carbohydrate balance last year. And the blue vertical line shows when we put on these treatments at petal fall. You'll see that from bloom on last year, we never had any deficits. It was all surplus. And in those years, it's really difficult to get good petal fall thinning. And then also at the 10 millimeter stage, we had surpluses, and Gala just flat out didn't thin. And I heard Mario, or I think it was Mario, comment in a recent meeting that it was a tremendous hand thinning job for growers. We just couldn't get the right thinning. Sometimes people backed off because of the frost we had on May 18th last year. But nevertheless, we didn't back off at Geneva, and we put out these treatments. And I want you to look in the bottom table. We had an unthinned control. It ended up with 650 fruits. The second column is the fruit set. 289 means that for every 100 clusters, we had 289 fruits, which basically means we had 3 fruits on every cluster. And when we tried NA-7, which is our typical one, and we added Regulate because of a surplus, we didn't get any thinning at all. That was 0 response last year. And unfortunately, we had this ACC or Exceed and Regulate by itself, also no thinning response. So then we tried Exceed and NA and Regulate, and there seemed like numerically there was a small effect, but it wasn't different from the untreated control. In the last treatment number 6, we tried ACC and 7 unregulated, also no response. But Exceed and Maxell gave us a thinning response at petal fall last year, even under poor conditions. And so we went essentially down to 500 fruits, but that was essentially 2 fruits on every cluster versus 3 fruits on every cluster. When we didn't add any other thinning treatment to these trees all year, so you can see at the end the fruit size was not that great, but what it points out to me is that Exceed and Maxell worked to get us started on a difficult year to thin. Now, in the word part in this slide, I want to emphasize a couple of points. In the plant, Exceed, well, it's a precursor for ethylene. So in the plant, it's metabolized to produce ethylene. But this metabolic step requires an enzyme to make it happen. Thus, the production of ethylene is not a huge burst. When you apply ethanol, it's a huge burst of ethylene. Now, ethylene or ethanol is kind of a risky thinner. It is used in some places in the world, but I've never wanted to recommend it in Western New York. For example, it's used in Australia on Pink Lady at bloom. But high temperatures give a huge risk because you get a burst of ethylene and you can get over thinning. But ACC or Exceed has this metabolic step with an enzyme required. And therefore, it does not produce such a huge burst of ethylene. And therefore, it's much less risky at high temperatures. but it also works at low temperatures because the enzyme continues, not at such a high rate, but it continues to produce ethylene. So I'm starting to see that this product may have a very important place in our thinning thinking. And I present it for you today, and I was all excited to present this data until the frost. Because some places where galas are heavily damaged, they probably shouldn't get this treatment. But I would like to suggest some of you try this on a trial basis of putting out Maxell and ACC at Petal Fall, where you will likely get some thinning to help start you down the path of reducing crop loads from 500 or 600 fruits per tree down to 150, which is where we want to be. So the rate that we used here was 400 parts per million of Exceed and 150 parts of Maxell because last year was a surplus. This year, I'm suggesting just the standard 100 parts per million of Maxell and the 400 parts of Exceed for those of you that want to try it. Now, let me continue with some of the thoughts related to thinning this year. I'd suggest you wait till they're 5 to 6 millimeters. Some places are close. Now, an easy way to know that is just to look at the carbohydrate model, because in the next to the last column, we have a degree day calculator. If you put in your actual full bloom date, and let me pause and say full bloom is when 80% of the flowers or 4 flowers in every cluster are open, not when 100% of the flowers are open. So if you put in that date, it will then calculate from that day forward degree days. And we want to spray the petal fall thinners between 100 and 125 degree days after full bloom. I've looked at that for a number of places all around Western New York and Saratoga County, and this is my prediction. For places close to the lake, in this case it was Cherry Lawn Farms, that's going to start Wednesday and go through Saturday. But inland down in Fairville, it already started today and goes through Wednesday, that degree day window. Now, Medina is even warmer, and so it started yesterday and will go through Wednesday, whereas Waterport up along the lake, where I picked, was starting Wednesday and going through Saturday. So generally, I would say in Western New York lake sites, we'll look to thin for petal fall sometime between Wednesday and Saturday, whenever you can get a decent day to spray. Inland sites got to start looking now. Unfortunately, tomorrow's rain, so I think Wednesday, probably afternoon, to me, it looks like the rain will have passed. You've got to start thinning and carry over into Thursday. Now, in Clifton Park in Saratoga County, this window already started on Sunday, Mother's Day, and goes through Wednesday. So when there's a window there, it's time to start thinning. Now, the data that Mike Basedow provided in more northern Saratoga County showed smaller fruit sizes. I didn't look at any other weather station except Kevin Bowman's, and that shows this window Sunday to Wednesday, whereas you more northern Saratoga County people would be closer this Wednesday to Saturday timing of the lakeside of Western New York. Now, I want to present 3 or 4 slides of my tips for successful. I think it's critical to assess each block for flower damage. This year is such a variable damage level, it's just striking. If most of the kings are present, I think you've got to thin like as a full crop. So if more than 50% of the kings are present, you've got to thin with a full rate, because you really only need about, of all those kings, you only need less than 50% of them to set, and they will set. But if king flowers are damaged 50% or more, then I think you still thin, but with lower rates. But where we had, like I showed with that data from Janet Van Zoren, both kings and laterals are damaged, I'd suggest you don't thin at petal fall. Let's wait and assess the situation at 10 millimeters to 12 millimeters when it'd be much more clear which fruits are really growing and whether you have only 1 fruit left in a cluster or you have 3 fruits left in a cluster, and how many clusters are on a tree. So those are sort of 3 rules of thumb I throw out for your consideration. I really hope you will use this degree day timing to put your petal fall sprays on. Let's talk about nozzling the sprayer. We suggest for good blocks to nozzle so that 1/3 of the output is applied to the bottom half of the tree, but 2/3 of the output is applied to the top half of the tree. Now, after I saw some of the data from both Craig and Janet, where the bottoms of the trees were really light already because the frost was so damaging, I would say don't put any thinner on the bottom of the tree if you thin that block. Put it all in the top half of the tree. Now, let me comment about surfactants. Regulate does increase the response of NAA, and if you add it, you will get much more thinning. So I had previously last year proposed these two rules. On years in Petal Fall where there's no carbohydrate deficit, put it in. But this year there is a carbohydrate deficit, so I suggest you do not include Regulate. I'll review quickly my suggested 4-spray program for both Honeycrisp and Gala. I suggest a bloom thinner for each of them, ATS for Honeycrisp and NAA for Gala. But this petal fall timing for Honeycrisp, I suggest quite a high dose of NAA and 7, if there's a high number of kings that are still alive. But for Gala, I'm suggesting Maxell and 7, but as an alternative, this Maxell and Exceed that I talked about earlier. Now, I know that some of the Valent people are listening to me, but I wish they weren't, because what I'm going to tell you goes against what they say. We have tried Exceed several years in a row and get very minimal thinning from Exceed alone. And I showed you data, even putting Regulate with it. We always get better thinning when we mix Maxell and Exceed. So I suggest that you don't spend the money on Excel or with Exceed unless you mix it with Maxell, because it's a relatively expensive product. Now, that's not their standard company line, but that seems to be what's worked best for us. Anytime you're going to spend money on Exceed, make sure you put Maxell with it to get a little better bang for your buck. I think that's a good option this year where you've got a strong set of Gala. And then it goes forward with basically a Maxell and 7 program after that. Some final suggestions. I think it's critical to use a carbohydrate model to both adjust the timing and the rate. This year, if you wait till Friday to spray, or Saturday, or Sunday, or Monday, look at the carbohydrate model again, because the forecast doesn't always work out. And what I'm seeing right now is forecasted up till then, but then when you look at it again on, say, Saturday, it might be a little different than what we expected. I don't expect any carbohydrate deficits less than -60, but if they do materialize, don't spray, wait it out. Now, Petal Fall, all thinners have a moderate effect and are thus very safe. So I hope that my big concern is that my little bit of caution will make you really cautious and you won't spray. I think there's a really great crop in many places that needs a Petal Fall thinning spray. And there's little risk that you'll overthin, especially where you still have more than 50% of the kings alive. The carbohydrate deficit indicates we'll have a moderate deficit, but will help us get really good thinning. It may be that we might achieve most of our thinning with this spray if we don't chicken out. So I suggest you use full rates. We'll have down here the high rate if I have for Honeycrisp, 3 to 4 ounces of NAA. Cortland's, I didn't look at any Cortland blocks, but I want to restate what both Jim Eve and Vaughn said, that Cortland blocks are pretty bad. Maybe they should strike that. We don't need any thinning on them. But Gala, Snapdragon, and Empire, where they're both or all 3 are strong, they need a full dose of Maxell and 7, or alternatively, Maxell and Exceed. Evercrisp and Max can be thinned much easier, and you can wait till 10 millimeters, but you can also get started now because we have a deficit. Who knows when we get to 10 millimeters if it'll all be a surplus and we won't get the thinning we want. But a low dose of NAA and 7 on those 2 varieties will work great. Now, these rates are all tree roll volume dilute rates. And I want to repeat, and that you guys probably get very tired of this kind of talk, but all the rates that I give you are for a dilute spray. This requires that you calculate the tree roll volume of every block and then calculate for that block at what you call a concentration factor. That's basically the tree roll volume divided by the volume that you spray with. For example, if your block is a nice tall spindle block, 11 feet tall, about 4 or 5 feet wide, 11-foot rows, that's going to measure probably 200 gallons. But you're only spraying 100. Therefore, your concentration factor is 2. So when you calculate how much you put in the spray tank, you take the rate that I gave you. Let's say for this case, it's Honeycrisp. And I said put 3 ounces of NAA per 100 dilute. But you have to multiply that by a concentration of 2, which is our concentration factor, because you're only spraying 100 gallons instead of 200 gallons. That means we need 6 ounces of NA in every 100 gallons. My sprayer holds is 500 gallons, therefore I have 5 of those. So I multiply it by 5. That means in my sprayer, I put 30 ounces of NAA or Frutonel or Pomaxa in the spray tank. I hope that's really clear, because in your spray tanks, you're going to be somewhere 20 to 30 ounces per spray tank. I don't like to use a concentrating factor for 7. I just like to put in 1 pint per 100, so 5 pints in a sprayer. But other people do, and so that's fine. If you concentrate it, then instead of the 5 pints of 7 in the sprayer, you'd put in 10 pints of 7 in the sprayer. But remember, that last 5 pints is just sitting on the leaf. It's not in solution, but if it rains, it is reabsorbed and will give you more thinning. So where you want strong thinning, you might consider, the 2 pints of 7, 10 pints per sprayer. But where you don't want more thinning, just stick with the 1 pint per 100 or 5 pints in a sprayer. And if you put any surfactants like Regulate in, do not use the concentration factor to adjust the dose, just 1 pint per 100. Now, if we get this spray done this week, then we'll really need to know where we're at. And I really think it's a great year for you to measure fruitlets with calipers and use the fruit growth rate model. So to review, you would wait about 50 more degree days after the day you spray. So suppose you spray on Thursday, then you look at the carbohydrate model and say, okay, on that day I had 120 degree days, you wait 50 more. So that would take you up to say 170, and then you'd make your first measurements. 15 spurs on 5 trees, that's 375 little fruitlets. And then you go back to those same fruitlets and measure them again, enter your data in the fruit growth rate model. On the MaluSim app, it should be on your phone. Alternatively, you can use a Todd Einhorn measuring fruits by picking 200 fruits and weighing them individually and running his model. But in either case, this model is going to help you understand how many fruit are actually growing on the tree. Because when you get to 10 to 12 millimeters, there, if you make a mistake, you get over thinning. Or if you don't spray, you end up with way too many fruits. Now, I would offer that if you take data and go to the trouble and you can't figure it out, send me the data and I'll help you interpret it. Anybody in the state. I end with just this suggested strategy for Honeycrisp that I want you to keep in your mind. We should have already got on 2 ATS sprays. We should now put on an NA and 7 spray. We'll come back around 12 millimeters and put on another NA and 7 spray. But then the week after that, we're going to start these 4 ethereal sprays. Now, interestingly enough, we compared last year ethereal at these timings with Exceed at these timings. And they both work beautifully because Exceed produces ethylene in the plant. Now, Valent is not too enthused about that. They approve of Exceed at this 15 to 18 millimeter timing, but they're not so sure they want me to say it works when you apply it later for return bloom. But I know I'm just on this slide, I'm only putting up ethereal because those 4 ethereal sprays now for the past 3 years in a row have resulted in just excellent return bloom on Honeycrisp. And I think this is the answer to what we've dealt with for years of the biennial bearing of Honeycrisp. So with that, I'm going to stop and thank you for your attention. Now end my slide share and I'm open to discussing any of it with any questions.
All right, thank you very much, Terence. At this point, we do still have about 9 minutes before 5, so I would like to invite people, if you do have questions, please go ahead and type those into the chat box. Alternatively, you can unmute yourself and we can ask questions directly. So please go ahead if you do have any questions.
Terence, what degree base are you using?
4 degrees Celsius, which
Or,
is,
okay, thank you.
yeah, so it's a lower than the insect ones, but that's more the plant-based physiology one.
Thank you.
Terence, we have a question from Mark. Any info about using a range for Honeycrisp that are in their off year this year?
So a range is a gibberellic acid, and as I've said in previous presentations, gibberellin is the anti-flowering hormone. So if you spray that in the off year, you're attempting to stop flower development in honeycrisp just to the right level. But that is what I have trouble with. I'm not a fan of it. I know others have tried it and seem to be okay with it, but my fear is that in the off year, we'll spray a range and then we'll have 2 off years if we do it wrong. Now, one important consideration if you're going to use a range is that honeycrisp flower initiation happens from about almost now, but let's say when fruits get to about 10 millimeters, up through mid to late June. So that a range has to be sprayed in that window to get flower inhibition with honeycrisp.
All right, thank you, Terence. We have a question from Kevin. Pink Lady, is it an easy thinner or more difficult? Where would you kind of rate that one at, and what would you recommend for it?
Easy to thin. So like Max, either low dose of NA and 7 or sometimes just 7, but it's relatively easy to thin.
All right, thank you. Chris asked, how should the sprayer be nozzled for the return bloom ethereal sprays?
What we've done is just the 2/3 in the top, 1/3 in the bottom, because I think that it impacts the whole tree with that ethylene that is produced from the spray. Now, generally, because of more sunlight, you have more flower buds in the top of the tree, and that's where we want to somehow counteract more fruit in the top 3. So we want to counteract the gibberellin that the seeds are producing in the on year so that we can get some flower initiation. So I would stick with the 2/3 in the top half, 1/3 in the bottom.
All right, thank you. Mark asked, what temps do I need to use Maxell at Petal Fall, and does it matter as much compared to, say, a 10 millimeter application?
Yeah, it seems to me that we've not had great success when temperatures are below 70 with Maxell. But that was before we had Exceed to mix with it. So with Exceed, I think it's a whole new ball game, and I don't have the experience to say. That's why I would like to see people try it on a trial basis this year, where our temperatures are modest. We'll be happy if we get to 70, but I think it's going to work.
Okay, great, thank you. I have a question for you, Terrence. I don't have much experience with it yet. Evercrisp, is that an easier to thin, or where does that one fall?
Easy to thin, almost easy to thin. It's often over thinned, especially when it's young. Now, as the trees get older and we're starting now to get significant acreage that it's older, it can be thinned more like a Macintosh with 5 parts of NA and a pint of 7. But in the young years, that 5 parts of NA will just clean the trees. So in that case, if it's under 5 years old, I like to go with only 2.5 parts of NA and a pint of 7.
Okay, great, thank you. And the other question I had for you, I tend to get this one on an annual basis. For young trees where you want to clean everything off, what's your recommendation?
So the thing that's worked the best is the main spray should go on at the 12 millimeter timing, because that's when the trees are most sensitive. Now, if you want to get some of it done now, that's fine. But Maxell, 7, and oil at the 12 millimeters has worked the best for cleaning fruit off of trees. And then hope you have a carbohydrate deficit, because if you spray at that timing with a surplus, you don't get very many fruit to fall off when you want them to fall off. So I'll just also throw in this little comment. The weather has a huge impact on thinning. There have been years when we have a significant carbohydrate deficit of -50, -60. We get almost enough natural thinning just from that weather event that we don't even need chemical thinners. But those are rare, but they have happened. In the last 10 years, I think we've had 3 of those years, particularly in the Hudson Valley, but also in the Capital District. And I think one year we even had that kind of thing up in the Champlain. But in most years, like this year, where we're looking at deficits in the -20 range, -30 range, There's little risk of overthinning, but that deficit helps tremendously to get the thinning we want. And those are the wonderful years where things just thin down beautifully. Unfortunately, we've had about a third of the years in the last 10 where the opposite has been true. We've had carbohydrate surpluses, and there, no matter what we try, we can't get enough thinning, and we're always stuck with hand thinning. That's where I'm hopeful that this Exceed will find a place in our industry where we need that ethylene in the mix.
All right, thank you, Terrence. I see someone from Smith Farms unmuted themselves. Would you like to ask a question?
So I see Mario's asked the question, the
Yep.
rate they quoted for Maxell and Exceed 100 parts per million of Maxell. That's essentially a gallon to the acre for a full-grown tall spindle, and 400 parts per million of Exceed. Now that has switched to a soluble granular form, and I don't have memorized in my mind how many granular ounces of Exceed but there's a table on the label that shows you how to get that 400 parts per million.
All right, thank you, Terrence. See, we're at 4:58. Any last questions for Terrence before we head off the meeting, or for anyone else that spoke today? All right, well, not hearing any, I think we'll go ahead and conclude the meeting. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Mario and Craig, Terrence, and Jim and Vaughn for joining us as well and for giving us your insights. Greatly appreciate it.